Hello, and welcome to Insurrection with Brenton Lengel. I am your host, Brenton Lengel, formerly carried on the Starcom radio network, now carried on Facebook because COVID, and I wanted people to see my face. So for those of you who are just joining, I just finished moderating a debate between Dr. David Friedman and Dr. Richard Wolff. Like Battle of the Titans, a Marxist versus an Anarcho-Capitalist, and these two are probably two of the most, I would say, well-spoken, well-researched, and well-educated progenitors of their specific philosophy. I probably misused progenitors there. But anyway, as I was the moderator for this debate, I feel like it would be inappropriate for me to pick sides. And in fact, we will be having Dr. Richard Wolff and Dr. David Friedman on the show very, very soon. But before then, I wanted to just, we normally do a post-debate analysis here. So I have Ben Burgis and Todd Lewis, Ben Burgis of the Give Them an Argument podcast and Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. So why don't you guys introduce yourselves just in case someone doesn't know who you are, and we will continue in the unlikely event that someone doesn't know who you are. All right. Ben, why don't you go first?
Sure. I am a philosophy instructor at Perimeter College. I'm a columnist for Jacobin Magazine. And as you already mentioned, I am the host of Give Them an Argument podcast. And I have, I've known Richard Wolff a little bit. I was on his show once and interacted with him a little bit on the Michael Brooks show, but I guess that's about enough about that for now.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Todd?
Yeah, I'm Todd Lewis. I run the YouTube channel, the Praise of Folly podcast, where I talk about things ranging from politics, philosophy, history, economics, all sorts of what we might call, broadly speaking, the social science materials.
Excellent. So both of you guys are some of the really, you guys are both super smart. Both of you guys are familiar with these figures. So I figured we'd sort of just, let's start off talking about the opening statements. Now, David Friedman led. What was your opinion of David Friedman's opening statement? We'll give the first word to Todd, and then we'll move to Ben.
Yeah. So one of the things about David Friedman that I think is interesting is he makes the claim that the worker is almost shopping for a firm, and so that the worker can then sort of competitively work for his labor. What's interesting is that would work in a labor market that is largely full, right? If it's a small labor market and you're near full employment, then maybe you could do that. But if it's a labor market that's really, wide open, not even close to full employment, then the other firms, even if you're just a little bit better than the next guy, it's like, look, there's so much labor out there. You don't really need to raise the rates that much, the wages. So it's kind of actually odd that his argument kind of assumes full employment, even though he's not really explicitly stating it. Because if you don't have full employment or near full employment, then that argument doesn't really work. But it could work in a situation near full employment, which maybe he thinks that would be the case, but that's not made clear. So it was kind of interesting that he's starting from an assumption that's typically associated with left-wing socialist Marxist thinking, not libertarian anarchist one. And I think that in that regard, that's maybe an interesting point. And generally speaking, I think it's a classic libertarian opening. David Friedman, unlike the deontological ANCAPs who are associated with the Mises Institute, takes a more consequentialist bent. He famously once said that he talked with his father about his theories, and Milton said, well, it's not likely to work, and David's like, well, I think it is likely to work. So it's a more consequentialist, empirical, and we saw a lot of that with his reference to historical examples. Mm-hmm. And I think that also makes it easier to engage with David, because David is sort of dealing with something more tangible than just pure abstract theory. So those are my thoughts on his opening statement.
All right, yeah, that's a really good point. I like that you opened up critically and then warmed. So, Ben, what are your thoughts on the opening statement?
Yeah. So yeah, like Todd said, a lot of that was like pretty standard kind of classic libertarian stuff. I mean, one thing that I found a little odd about it was that in the very beginning he said that he acknowledged that Professor Wolff isn't advocating Soviet-style socialism, but then by the end of the opening statement, he really seemed to be focusing all of his fire on Soviet-style socialism. That that his big he gave a kind of a priori argument for against socialism. Although even the a priori argument against socialism was kind of based on the idea that what he was arguing against was Soviet-style socialism, because he said because it was all about hierarchy, and I I don't want to go too deep a dive maybe in this to like the things that I'd be critical about the assumptions that he'd make. I want to try to keep the focus on the bigger picture things about the way he's structured his argument. But then as it went on, he's talking more and more about the problems with that kind of Soviet style capital C communism. He's like his big empirical argument is about East Germany and West Germany and North Korea and South Korea and China and Taiwan. And so none of that, he started talking more about worker cooperatives as the debate went on. But in there, like in his opening, it was almost more like what you'd expect if you were debating this like a tanky, who is actually an advocate and defender of that system. And I will say something that I found a little odd about it. I don't know, odd maybe is not the right word, but something I found a little frustrating about it, right, was this that he sort of said, okay, well, worker cooperatives are fine, right? That's just another kind of firm, and you can have all different kinds of firms within capitalism. And to my mind, that kind of misses the point of like the actual thing that somebody like Wolff is going to disagree with libertarian about. Because it's a little bit like saying that if you're arguing about monarchy and democracy, and you said, well, parliaments are fine if the king recognizes them. So, okay, sure, right? That is something that's consistent with monarchism, but what you're actually arguing about is whether to believe in the divine right of kings in the first place, whether kings have an innate right to rule or be legitimate to overthrow them and have a parliament. And I think what you're actually arguing about in something like the Freidman Wolff debate is expropriation, right? Whether it would be okay to take away the means of production from their current owners to transfer them to some form of workers' control. And so just sort of saying that, if you happen to have worker cooperatives within the existing system, that's fine. I think, and I think there's more that Wolff could have done to clarify this later. Don't get me wrong, right? But I think that in a way it's sort of oddly beside the point.
Yeah, I noticed that was kind of one of their core disagreements, and both parties did kind of dance around it. I didn't see a lot of people. I didn't see either of them really address the point of expropriation. That might be something to hit in a follow-up debate. So let's move on to Dr. Richard Wolff's opening. So let's have Ben. Why don't you go first? So, how did you feel his opening was? You feel like he came out of the gate strong? What was your sense on that?
Yeah, I think he did come out of the gate fairly strong. I think that the one thing, I guess I'll probably keep this short and sweet. The one thing that I think that he could have. I think the one thing that maybe he could have usefully done differently was the way that he did handle the issue about the Soviet Union and all of that, because I think first of all, I think that I could imagine somebody who was just hearing all this from him for the first time, like hearing him talk about this that think, oh, so like socialists used to all support this, right? And now he's saying that socialists support something completely different, and that does really play in his narrative at the beginning. That, well, hey, socialists advocated this, it didn't really work, so now they're saying something completely different. Whereas if it had been me, the line that I would have taken would be pointing out, and there was a little bit of this later in the debate, but pointing out that like Marx and Engels, for example, were very clearly advocating something more like what Wolff is talking about than the Soviet model, and then and I guess also sometimes there's a distinction between just sort of saying everything that's true and usefully addressing the core argument in a debate, and it can be a hard distinction to make because anytime that like if you're arguing with somebody who you think is saying a bunch of things that aren't true or aren't justified, then obviously your impulse is going to be to correct the record on every single point, and it's actually incredibly difficult not to do that. But it could also be a big mistake. So, it might well be true. Now, I might be getting my parts of the debate mixed up about where he made some of these points, but I believe it was his opening statement at the very end. Like he had 2 minutes left, it turned out, and so he was going to use, which, by the way, I also tend to think is a mistake, but that's more of a matter of personal style. I think if you've come to a good ending point, you should just end. But he talked about East Germany, and he said something that may very well be true, right? Like I'm certainly not any kind of expert on German industrial history, so I couldn't tell you. I guess it sounds right based on what I've heard, but that industrial development before 1945 was much more in West Germany than East Germany, which makes the comparison between the two inexact. And that, even though that might be true, though, I think it was at the very least kind of a tactical mistake to bring that up, because it really muddied the question of whether he is advocating democratic socialism, where worker cooperatives would be the standard type of firm, or whether he's advocating for or defending or half defending the record of the Soviet style system, and that had been relatively clear, but I think kind of taking the bait on East Germany, probably muddies those waters, and it also gives him an opening to do exactly what Friedman did later in the debate, which is to say, well, okay, hold on, right? Maybe you're right about East Germany, but come on, this system had all these other failures. What about this? What about that? What about that?
That was, it was really interesting to see that too, because I was not aware that was the deal with East Germany. And I think it strikes me as it's probably true, and probably, contributed in large part to a lot of the economic problems in that sector of Germany. The only thing that kind of gives me pause on that is I'm surprised that the communists let them partition Germany that way. But I'm guessing there were tactical reasons for that, as opposed to simply trying to equally partition out the industrial and rural sections of the country. But that's a fascinating bit of history. And I'd heard the East Germany versus West Germany argument before, but I hadn't actually gotten the specific history behind it. And so many of these arguments, oftentimes when they are presented that way, it takes looking into the historical record just a little bit more to kind of explain and understand situations that might seem a little more outlandish than we otherwise would. So, Todd, what are your thoughts on Richard Wolff's opening?
I was just going to say, Brent, real quickly, that much I actually do know the answer to, which is just that this wasn't like a planned, negotiated thing. Really, it was just that the Soviet zone of occupation at the end of World War II was East Germany, because that's the direction they were coming from, and the American zone of occupation,
West.
Yeah. So then they just kind of I think there were a lot of situations like that at the end of World War II, Korea and Vietnam, at least. Well, okay, at least those three, right? Where there were different powers who were controlling different parts of a country at the end of the war, and there was some sort of, maybe at the time, maybe even in 1945, there was some understanding or claim that eventually they'd come up with some way to reunify it. But then, like, as the Cold War started, people just sort of dug in where they were.
Absolutely. So, Todd, what's your feeling on Dr. Richard Wolff's opening statement?
Yeah, so I think one of the problems was, so Richard Wolff opens up and he says, I don't like the definition of socialism that David's giving. And so he's like, their socialism is an evolving concept and an evolving thing. And of course, what, as you point out, Ben, he should have avoided doing was getting bogged down and arguing about China and Russia. But that's exactly what he did. And instead of doing that, what he should have done is articulated what he thought socialism should be and just avoid that all as a red herring. Now, that's not to say David was laying bait. I don't think he was. I think David was operating with a definition that he was familiar with. And the problem is with a lot of modern day socialism, you can get very divergent views of it. So, for example, if you go to like C4SS, they'll say that socialism is a totally free market. And they'll cite Benjamin Tucker. You can talk to anarchists and they'll say it's, worker syndicates. And so, depending on the socialist you talk to, the examples they're going to provide, the theory they're going to use to describe their ideal socialist model, you don't know, if you don't know who you're dealing with, then you're just going to more likely than not default to what you already know. And what Wolff should have done is define what he meant by that and then avoided the red herring of, because as you said, right, it's an evolving thought ideology that we've moved beyond that phase. And the other thing is he points out that there are other like prior historical models of production solving the coordination problem that are pre-capitalist. But I think the really interesting question that he doesn't bring up is, are they in any way likely able to maintain the current level of material conditions that he and David would want to preserve? Likely not. Second of all, if socialism could, so what he has proven, what he's demonstrated minimally, at least attempted to demonstrate, is that there is more than one way to solve the coordination problem. But the real question is, can you solve the coordination problem in such a way that everybody has the kinds of material conditions that we're expecting today? And Wolff didn't really get into that at all. I think another thing that Wolff did that was just really sort of inexplicable and was not a good use of his time was when he talked about sort of his own education and background and going to Harvard, for whatever anecdotal interest that might have. That's not really relevant to the debate or to the points that David Friedman was actually making. And I sort of was left at the end of this. So, okay, well, what does socialism mean for Wolff? Like, what is his view of a socialist society? What is he advocating for? So, for example, if we talk to like anarchists, like say you, Brenton, you could point to the CNT in Spain. You could point to Makhno in Ukraine. You could point to some example that would help crystallize the image, right?
Yeah.
Tankies can point to the USSR and China. Well, Wolff couldn't really do that, right? Now, maybe it's purely theoretical. Okay, well, then it doesn't leave you with a lot of historical examples. But then what I would have expected Wolff to do is sort of say, okay, this is what I mean by socialism. And I don't mean the Soviet Union, and I don't mean whatever David Friedman thinks I mean. I mean this. Mm-hmm. I also think that if the actual debate was to be about expropriation, which I mean, I didn't know that, and it wasn't clear.
Well, that wasn't what the debate was supposed to be about. I just think that was the core issue between the two of them.
Issue.
Well, if I could just clarify that really quickly, right? So, like, I think that what Wolff said at several points of the debate is that what he means by socialism is having workers control the production process. And he did point later on.
He pointed to Mondragon Corporation.
And the region in Italy, whose name I can never remember, but yeah, that's so he did point to those test cases, but then, like, I think the reason I said expropriation seems like the core of the difference is because I take it you brought up C4SS, and Kevin Carson and those guys, as I understand it, right? Like, their hope is that a completely stateless market would just result in that. And of course I think that like their only difference with somebody like Friedman would just be that he wouldn't make the same prediction, right? That he had said, no, if we have a completely stateless market, it wouldn't work out that way. But I take it, right, that like the actual, like in some ways, like that's not that interesting to debate, right? Because you want all the same things, you just have different predictions about how they play out. I take it that what differentiates Wolff from Friedman, because remember, Friedman said one of the first things he said in his opening statement was that he was totally fine with worker cooperatives, that he didn't have a problem with that. So I think that the interest in difference is whether it's expropriation or, let's put it this way, tax incentives to expropriation and everything in between, right?
Yeah.
Is the idea that there's some sort of political action that you should do to bring that about, which would presumably be some sort of political action that would violate Friedman's libertarian principles. Because if that's not what they disagree about, then I guess I don't know what they disagree about.
No, it totally makes sense. Now, before we get into that, because I did want to get into their disagreements, it's a debate. It's all disagreement technically. But I did want to push back a little bit on something Todd said, just because, and it may actually have been I guess a bit of a non sequitur when he was talking about his education. But the talk about the education, that actually, this is a bit of background, moderator. They were backstage before the debate, like talking about, because they had been in overlapping classes at Harvard. So they were kind of reminiscing a little bit about that before they went in. And I think that might have prompted Dr. Wolff to go down that road, because one of the things that he did, and I don't know if you guys have ever had this experience, but something he said in that really actually did resonate with me as a moderator, and I tried not to show it because I need to be impartial. But I remember when I was working at a university, I wasn't attending. I was working as a fundraiser at a university in New York. And this was kind of during the heyday of Occupy Wall Street. And I was really, diving kind of head first into a lot of the radical stuff. And I had found this obscure point by Marx that had to deal with, like, if the price of silver goes up, then another commodity will inevitably fall as a result of that. So the price of silver goes up, the price of silk falls, the price of Xboxes increases, the price of gas goes down for some reason. So I went to an economics professor at that university, and this is New York City, where you expect people to be pretty liberal, and I asked him, I said, hey, there's this thing I read that Karl Marx said, is there any empirical evidence to show this is the case? That was my question. The professor did not answer my question and instead told me to read Milton Friedman. Of course, David D. Friedman's father. And I also, at the same time, in universities, I have a friend who's an econ PhD. And he was the guy that originally convinced me to become an anarchist, partially by arguing with him on the internet. When he went to, and I won't say the school that he went to or his name or anything, but when he went into his economics program, he actually was asked by the school, are you now, or have you ever been, a member of a socialist party? And what he came to understand from that question was, if he had said yes, he would not have been accepted into his graduate econ program. So, Richard Wolff talking about the fear of simply discussing this, it may have been a little bit beside the point, but as far as at least for me, that was something I really connected with, that I felt was true. And I know, Ben, I know you work in academia, so you may have a better perspective on this, but I've seen now 2 examples of that going on in academia. So, I mean, is that something that's still common, or was this just a fluke?
My sense is that it's well, I don't know. I guess I can't really speak to this because I think he's talking about economics, really, and I do what I am confident about is that economics departments do lean very right, and that whatever. I mean, I actually find it sort of God. I remember there was a time like last year that I was going back into a classroom I'd been teaching in. I was kind of waiting outside because I think I'd left my headphones in there, and it was an economics class, and I was overhearing it for a few minutes. And all I could think was, man, all the effort I put into being into studiously making sure I'm not imposing my political views on my classes, and there's just no effort whatsoever in these econ classes, is there? But that said, I do still agree with Todd that, as interesting as it is, I'm not really sure that was the best. I guess I'm not totally sure what it was doing in that debate, right? I do take his larger point about it, which is that, which I've heard him make before. About the kind of legacy of McCarthyism in the way that, in the way that economics departments certainly work. And I think he has a critique of econ academia that I largely agree with. But again, I don't know that it was necessarily adding anything to that. Again, I think that just certainly my strong stylistic preference is if you've kind of gotten up to your point and you've made it and you've got a good stopping point, then let the other guy have the 2 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Todd, do you have any thoughts on that, or if not, we'll move on?
Well, I did want to finish a point about Wolff's opening. One of the things that Wolff does, and a lot of socialists do this, is they'll say that the freedom of capitalism is illusory because if you don't work for the wage they're going to hire you for, you're free to leave and in worst case scenario, starve. Now, the problem isn't that this isn't actually the real disagreement, because if nobody works full stop at whatever mode of production you have, you starve. That's just what happens if nobody works, no matter what the mode of production is. And socialists have a mode of production where they would compel you to work as well. So Noam Chomsky in 1967 was interviewed by Peter Jay, and Peter Jay asks him, well, what if nobody actually wants to share this work? I mean, worst case scenario, Noam, what do you do if nobody wants to share it? And then Noam Chomsky says, one alternative is to have it equally shared. The other is to design social institutions so that some group of people will simply be compelled to do the work on pain of starvation. These are the two alternatives. So this really isn't the point of contention and is really just more of a red herring, because even Chomsky admits that there's going to have to be likely some social arrangements under a socialist economy that you have to do it or you'll starve. And that's really just a function of material conditions. And so I think it was more of a red herring and wasn't really helpful to the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Well, the distinction I would make is being forced to work versus being forced to work for a boss. Because I think that in lots of contexts, non-socialists non-socialists don't have any trouble understanding that if somebody can only have a job if they do something, they're thereby being forced to do it. In fact, this is a staple of right-wing propaganda. Right to work. That if you have to join a union to have a job, then you're being thereby your rights are being violated. You're being forced to have that job, even if it's a result of a voluntary contract between an employer and a union. Certainly, when we have sexual harassment laws, the understanding is that if somebody, if your boss says sleep with me or you're fired, that is a form of coercion. And so, I think the question isn't whether you could. Whether you'd have a system where you have no coercion at all versus as much coercion as we have right now, and that if we have any coercion at all, then it's not an improvement, right? Or that this is just a red herring. I'd say rather that the question is whether you have more coercion or less coercion than you have right now. And you can, and look, I mean, this is not just putting it that way doesn't make it a slam dunk for socialism, because there are points in the debate where Friedman was kind of making this move that if you end up having to do direct extraction, like you end up having to do stuff like legally force people to work, then that would actually be more coercion than we have under capitalism. But if you at least don't force, people have to work, but they don't have to accept the domination of somebody else over them, that's plausibly a reduction in coercion.
Yeah, let me just clarify the point here. It's not that the issue is being compelled to work. It's who is compelling the work and why. See, that's where the real distinction is. And I think just by playing out the, well, if you don't work, you'll starve, muddies the true difference. And it's that the capitalist David Friedman and the socialist Wolff disagree over who should be doing the compelling and under what circumstances and for what reasons.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective on that, Todd, which I think, I haven't really thought of it in those terms. My impression of it, at least with socialists, just to kind of answer it, is that it usually, and I think also was a natural direction for Dr. Wolff to go down, because capitalists tend to emphasize the freedom of choice that they say exists within the capitalist marketplace. So it's a natural thing to push back on, but I will agree that there's a more subtle argument to be had there, and that would have been an interesting thing to drill into, and maybe, hopefully, if there are future debates, they definitely will. Now, you guys know, and maybe this is too jargony and stuff, but I did want to make sure that we got this out. So, you've got essentially kind of like the three modes of debate. You've got the ethos, the pathos, and the logos. So, the argument, the emotive connection with it, and the credentials, I suppose, that they're bringing to the table. Now, both of these men had roughly very equal or close to equal ethos. I don't think we've ever had two debaters with that level of education going head to head on the channel before, which was really, really exciting. Particularly not just education, but also world renowned, and the publishing, and the fact that David D. Friedman is literally Milton Friedman's son. But who do you think did better in the pathos department, and why? And who do you think did better in the logos department, and why? And I guess we'll do Ben first, since Todd, you spoke last.
So pathos is emotional appeal. Which was logos?
Logos is logic, the argument. I guess.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, basically, there's the argument, and then there's, I guess, communicating the argument and connecting with the audience.
Yeah. Think about that. I guess. I think it was like a relatively, I think the whole thing was being conducted on a relatively unemotional level. That there are places where both of them could have gone much harder. Than there was a moment of it with. There was a moment like I guess when Friedman talked about people fleeing from East Germany to West Germany and stuff like that, that at least hinted at what a more emotionally charged version of it would have been, although I don't think he really went there particularly. And Friedman, I guess there was, and then Wolff, I think there was a little bit more of a hint of that. There was like a moment of emotional intensity where we started talking about colonialism and all of that. But I don't know how much of an issue that really was in this case. I think it was there was so much time spent in this and stuff like how cost benefit analyses work. I haven't met the person yet who gets teary about cost benefit analysis. So I don't know how relevant that is, but then as far as the actual structure of the arguments, I think maybe it was a little bit of a draw because I think one of my biggest frustrations with it was that I felt like both of them in large parts of the debate were like it was almost like one of those, like when people used to complain about presidential debates when they, that they'd be sort of parallel speeches, that it wasn't like that. And there were moments when I think there was some real engagement, especially when they did get a little bit more into the co-op question and why there are so few co-ops under capitalism. But I think that there's a significant sense in which neither of them was quite engaging with the things that matter most to the other one. So in Wolff's case, he wasn't really I think Wolff wasn't really addressing directly the stuff about voluntariness and hierarchy that was most important to Friedman's to Friedman's reasons for thinking what he thinks. And I mean, I think there's a lot that could have been said about that, right? But in terms of undermining the idea that the capitalist arrangements are truly voluntary, and also undermining the idea that just sort of respecting whatever sort of property rights you start out with at any given stage of history is really a matter of freedom and voluntariness. But he didn't really go there, and Friedman, and I think that Friedman never really, he did a little bit, right? But I think that he could have gone a lot further for my satisfaction in addressing why it is that that workplace democracy would be desirable in the first place, like why it's lack. So I guess that would be my big critique in both cases, just on an argument level, whatever you actually make of what the right answer to either of these questions is, that I think that Wolff would have been more effective if he'd engaged more with why, with the voluntariness question. And I think that Friedman would have been more effective if he'd engaged more with the desirability of workplace democracy question.
Yeah, great points. Todd?
So, yeah, I think that, well, as far as the emotion level, right, nobody got too heated, nobody got too angry. I think I would give David the logo side, and I'd give Wolff the pathos side, because he's making more arguments for against injustice as he sees it, right? He's appealing to that rather than to some sort of logical structures that say someone like David is appealing to. And I think, because this is something that Chomsky's pointed out too, with how the word libertarianism has sort of been sniped by people like Murray Rothbard to mean free market capitalism from its older European usage for socialism. By playing the card for voluntary, non-coercive, that means, the audience is probably going to be an American audience, or more broadly a Western audience, right? So Friedman is playing to the audience, because that's something that's going to sound good, right? It's, oh yeah, we don't want to be coerced. And then of course socialism is framed as these authoritarian state structures. Yeah. And so the whole loop is tailor-made for a Western audience. And so what Wolff failed to do was say, well, no, we don't want that authoritarian socialism, which would then, help at least, because he's got the uphill battle here, right? Because the audience that is watching, I mean, of course there'll be loyalist followers, but the average Western viewer is going to be more sympathetic to David, even if they think David's a little extreme. And so keep being cognizant of that, saying that, like I've seen with anarchists, they tend to say that, no, we're the true voluntary ones. And they then make their own argument based on that. That's something that I think he should have done, because again, all the rhetoric is implicitly on the side of David here, because in the Western world, the model that David is advocating in some form is already dominant and ascendant. And so part of the problem is that when you come out just attacking it directly as unjust, a lot of the people viewing the show aren't going to see that it's unjust. They're going to think that it's just and maybe that David goes too far. So the pathos doesn't work as well, because if you were speaking to some other audience, maybe somewhere in the third world, that might sound a lot more convincing. But I think that Wolff wasn't really dealing with these issues with relationship to the likely audience he was going to have.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really good point. And it is usually with socialists, you are having to deal with an uphill battle with an audience that doesn't understand your terminology. And, particularly like with modern day debates audience, which skews very far right, because the debate channel started out as a religious debate, and that attracted, primarily creationists, flat earthers, and new atheists, all of whom skew right and reactionary. So that's been changing, partially, I think, probably because, Ben, you've been bringing some wonderful people by. And also, I was really impressed with I didn't read all the comments at the end of the debate, and I haven't gone through the actual chat, but the comments at the bottom of the debate were some of the most positive ones that I've seen. People seemed like they were really gelling with the two of them, and that's very rare with modern day debate. I hopefully maybe they've cleaned up the community. I think I only saw one person trying to sneak in hate speech.
Yeah, I guess I don't know. I might push back a little bit and say I think that if anything, I think Wolff might have benefited from a little less logos and more pathos. And here's what I mean by that: that he was very focused on definitional issues and methodological issues, right? So the definitional issue about socialism. That he said, no, what differentiates capitalism from socialism, just in general, in his view, is who's controlling the production process. And so he was really focused on that definitional point and saying, what's going on with the government isn't relevant. What's relevant is what's going on with the production process, which might be even correct. I might even agree with that, but it's also, but then it sort of doesn't quite, if people have the biases that Todd is talking about, right? I think you need to go into the teeth of that and say, hey, if you're worried about, right, that somebody taking away, the government doing something bad and authoritarian, right? Here's why you don't need to worry about that. And these methodological issues, which again, I thought was kind of maybe a tactical mistake, not because I necessarily disagree with what he has to say about it, but he had all these methodological objections, because obviously it comes out of economics is an academic field, and so he has all these methodological objections to how economists talk and think and set up issues, and I think some of those are interesting and plausible objections, but also I think that it's maybe not the right setting for it, right? I think that rather than trying to do a philosophical deep dive on what really counts as evidence that the benefits are greater than the costs, I think trying to just more directly address quality of life issues would have been more effective, and I think in particular that would have been more effective if he had appealed. This is not language that I ordinarily use, but to people's lived experiences, right? That they had, if he'd said, so Friedman is telling you that that this is all voluntary transactions, so you have no complaint, but think about what it's like to be between jobs and really paint a picture of that, right? Think about, hey, even if you get another job a month later, you've lost your employer health insurance, when your new health insurance kicks in, it takes a month to get that first appointment with the new doctor, and you're counting, even if it's just a routine prescription, you're counting out your pills, right? This is not something that people can just shop around. Even in a really good labor market, people can't just shop around for work like they were crossing the street to go to a different gas station. And if he'd made that kind of frankly more emotional appeal. I think it probably would have been more effective. Rather, like at points, I think that probably he was being more abstract and academic than was necessarily like the most effective strategy, especially if you're overcoming the kind of resistance that was talked about.
Great. Hey, I think you just froze. Ben, you there? Yeah, you're working again. So we are just about out of time, but I wanted to end before we go into plugging and stuff. I did want to ask one more question to each of you. And Todd, since Ben spoke last, you'll speak first. As quickly as you can. Doesn't have to be super fast, but I know you guys have places to be. What do you think each speaker's strongest argument was? And we'll end on that. So what do you think first? What do you think David's strongest argument was? Or let's do it like this. Todd, what do you think David's strongest argument was? And Ben, what do you think Professor Wolff's strongest argument was?
I think David's strongest argument was when you look at when you look at social science, it's very difficult to have a control and a test for two ideas or theories. Now you can make criticisms of East-West Germany, North-South Korea, but this is about as good as a social science experiment with a control and a test as you're ever going to get. And so I think with an audience that tends to view empiricism and the scientific method as the primary means to determine truth, using a sort of social science quote unquote experiment like that is definitely one of the best, because you've controlled for geography in many cases, you've controlled for the ethnicity of the people involved, you've controlled for education, you've controlled for a lot of things much, much more than you could in other contexts.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. And I hadn't thought about that, but that is something that can be very quickly and easily understood. Ben, what do you think? What do you think Dr. Wolff's strongest point was?
I think his strongest point actually is kind of the same, right? For the same reason, right? Was about the actual evidence from Mondragon and from the province of Italy with the huge cooperative sector to really show that that this is possible, right? That it's almost like the it's almost like the like Galileo, right? And yet it moves, right? That like you can sort of give reasons in the abstract to say that we need to have this division between owners and workers, that it would be inefficient not to have it, but yet look at how well these work. And you could also really tell that when they did move onto that terrain, which is where they engage the most directly with each other's arguments, that it was the terrain that Wolff was the most comfortable on, right? Because I think he was able to, rather than sort of playing it out in terms of abstract predictions about what some economic theory tells you will happen, was able to just say, look, I work with people who are forming worker cooperatives, the Democracy at Work Foundation. These are all the reasons that it's hard to get them going. It's not any of this abstract stuff. It's has to do with how financing works. And I think you could tell he was very confident there, because that's really his home turf.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right. So one more question, and this just appeared because hopefully these two will lock horns again. I'd like to see it, and I think the audience would too. What would you like to see them argue about? We're going to go with Todd and then Ben. So what would you like the topic of their next debate to be?
Well, I think one of the key differences is what exactly is coercion, because both sides make arguments that the other side is unjust because they're acting in some coercive way, but then the way they understand coercion, they're like, well, my side isn't being coercive. So what is coercion? And because that's a real big hang up that sort of stops further development in a conversation. And that happened, in fact, when you debated, David, Brenton.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
You guys started arguing about what is coercion. And I think just dealing with that issue up front and making that the sole point of the debate would help clear out way for future development that we don't often get to see in these debates.
It's a really good point. And Ben, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean that's actually very close to what I was going to say, which which is that I would I would like the debate to be really about issues of freedom and property rights, and whether expropriation is justified, because I think that would carry it much closer to the nub than just kind of talking about socialism in this way, that where you're halfway arguing about the desirability or possibility of what Wolff wants, right, which is an economy dominated by worker cooperatives, and you're halfway arguing about East Germany and West Germany, and I think that it would be much more productive to have an argument that's directly about whether it would be okay to use some form of political action to bring about the sort of economy that Wolff wants, because I think that's where I mean basically I agree with Todd. I think that's where the most interesting disagreement lies.
Awesome. Well, those are two related and both very compelling topics. So hopefully we'll get them back. All right. So we are out of time. Thank you guys very much. Ben, do you want to plug your pluggables real quick?
Yeah, sure. So like I said, Jacobin columnist. You can look at Jacobin Mag /author /Ben-Burgis, or nobody's doing that's 2020. Just Google Jacobin Ben Burgis, and also host Give Them an Argument. The next episode coming up, that's recording this weekend, coming out as always on Monday night on my YouTube channel and all the usual podcast places. I'm talking to Matt Christman from Chapo Trap House.
Oh, that's great.
About well, maybe by then the election will have an outcome. We'll see. But I pitched it to him as, let's talk about whatever the hell will by that point have happened. And to Glenn Greenwald about his return to independent journalism. So really looking forward to both those conversations. Check that out.
Wow, yeah, that'll be a heavy-hitting podcast. I'm really excited for that one. So I've already got it on my phone, but I'm going to make sure to listen to that. So real quick, by the way, can you ask Matt Christman a question for me? It doesn't have to be on the podcast.
Sure, what's up?
He seems to possess the superpower of he looks exactly the way his voice seems to indicate he should look. How did he do that? Sure. So yeah, if you can ask him that for me, that would be wonderful. Todd, you want to plug your pluggables?
Yeah, you can find me on the Praise of Folly podcast. It's on my YouTube channel. Just type that into Google or YouTube, Praise of Folly podcast, and you'll see it come up.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys very much. This has been Insurrection with Brenton Lengel. Before we break, I just want to let everybody know my comic Snow White Zombie Apocalypse. I'm going to be launching the Kickstarter for issue number 3 on probably the 10th. Might push it back a little bit depending upon what happens with the election. But definitely, if you want to pick this up, we got nominated for 2 Ringo Awards. The second issue is out to Kickstarter backers. Will be out in comic stores nationwide very soon. If you want to get these issues ahead of time, you want them signed by me, back the Kickstarter. And really, I need your help on this because I cannot continue to produce these books without you. And they're fun stuff. They're zombies and class politics and feminism. So, all right. Thank you guys very much. And we will, I guess, come to an end here. All right. Catch you later.